The rain poured relentlessly, drenching the pavement and masking the sound of footsteps approaching the front porch. Emma stood there, gripping the hands of her two children, her breath shallow, her heart pounding. The cold seeped through her soaked clothes, but the real chill came from the man standing just a few feet away, Jake Carter. His dark blue eyes, once filled with confidence, now carried a desperation she had never seen before. His suit, immaculate as ever, clung to his frame, rain streaming down his face. He looked like a man who had everything: money, power, success. But in that moment he was nothing more than a father begging not to lose his family. "Emma," Jake's voice cracked. "Please don't do this." Emma's fingers tightened around Mateo's wrist. The boy stood rigid beside her, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the ground. Sophie, her little hands gripping Emma's dress, pressed her face against her mother's side, as if hiding from a storm far greater than the one pouring from the sky. "You already did this." Emma's voice was steady, but the pain in her chest was unbearable. Jake took a step closer, but she pulled the children back instinctively. "I made a mistake," he pleaded. "I know that now. But I can fix this. I need to fix this." Emma shook her head, her lips pressed into a tight line. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but none of her rehearsed words seemed enough now. "You think you can just walk back into their lives and fix everything?" Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with fury. "You left, Jake. You left before they could even say your name. You don't get to decide now that you're ready." The weight of her words hit him like a blow, but he didn't move. He couldn't. Mateo finally lifted his gaze, his deep brown eyes mirroring his mother's anger. "You left us," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper, but sharp enough to cut through the rain. Jake swallowed hard. "I was wrong. I thought I was protecting you." "Protecting us?" Emma let out a bitter laugh. "By disappearing? By making me tell my children every night that their father wasn't coming back?" Sophie peeked up at Jake then, her big, uncertain eyes searching his face. Her tiny voice, hesitant yet filled with unspoken questions, broke through the tension. "Are you leaving again?" Jake's entire body stiffened. "No," he said, his voice firmer now. "Never again." But Emma had heard those words before, in another lifetime, before he had walked away. "Mommy!" Sophie tugged at Emma's sleeve. Emma exhaled sharply. The past 5 years had been spent rebuilding what he had shattered. She had fought to keep them safe, to keep them whole. Letting him back in now. It wasn't just a risk. It was a gamble she couldn't afford. Jake took another step forward, but Emma's next words stopped him cold. "You don't belong here anymore." The rain continued to fall, pounding against the pavement, drowning out everything but the unspoken war between them. Then, as if sealing a decision she had fought against for too long, Emma turned, pulling her children with her. And just like that, Jake Carter was left standing in the rain, watching the only thing he had ever truly wanted slip through his fingers. Emma adjusted the strap of her bag over her shoulder as she walked through the park, keeping a careful eye on Mateo and Sophie as they ran ahead. The afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across the grass, the air carrying the scent of fresh earth after the morning rain. It was one of those rare days when she felt a sense of peace, however fleeting. Mateo, always the protective older brother, slowed his pace to let Sophie catch up. She giggled as she tugged on his sleeve, pointing toward the swings. Emma smiled to herself, feeling the warmth of the moment settle in her chest. These were the little pieces of happiness she had fought so hard to protect. Then, without warning, her body tensed. A strange sensation prickled at the back of her neck, as if someone was watching her. Her steps faltered, and a familiar unease crept in. It wasn't paranoia. She knew this feeling well. Emma turned her head slightly, scanning the area, her breath catching when her gaze locked onto a figure standing near the edge of the playground. Jake. Her mind struggled to process what she was seeing. He stood there, motionless, his hands tucked into the pockets of his dark coat. He hadn't changed much, same sharp jawline, same piercing blue eyes, but something about him felt different. His expression wasn't one of confidence or arrogance. It was hesitation. Emma's heartbeat roared in her ears. 5 years. 5 years of silence, of questions with no answers, of raising 2 children alone. And now he was here, Just like that. Her stomach twisted. He was watching them. Watching her children. Sophie squealed with delight as Matteo pushed her on the swing, completely unaware of the man standing a few yards away. Emma's hands curled into fists. No. She moved quickly, crossing the playground and reaching her children in seconds. "Mum?" Matteo noticed the shift in her energy, his face instantly cautious. Emma forced a smile, trying to keep her voice steady. "We need to go." Sophie pouted. "But we just got here." Emma bent down, brushing a loose strand of hair from Sophie's face. "I know, sweetheart, but we have to go now, okay?" Her daughter frowned but nodded, slipping her small hand into Emma's. Matteo followed her gaze toward the man by the trees, his face darkening. "Who is that?" Emma's breath hitched. She had dreaded this moment for years, but now wasn't the time, not here, not like this. "No one," she said too quickly. "Let's go." But before she could turn them away, Jake took a step forward. "Emma." Her entire body stiffened. His voice, deeper, rougher than she remembered, sliced through the air, making her grip tighten on Sophie's hand. Matteo looked between them, putting the pieces together at a speed that terrified her. "Wait," he said, his voice low, almost accusing. "Is that—" Emma inhaled sharply, but before she could respond, Jake answered for her. "Matteo." His voice wavered slightly. "I'm your father." The world tilted beneath her feet. Matteo flinched like he had been struck. Sophie, still too young to grasp the weight of the words, simply looked up at her mother in confusion. Emma felt as if the ground had been ripped from under her. The life she had carefully rebuilt was about to shatter right here in the middle of a park. Her pulse thundered. Anger, fear, panic. It was too much. She met Jake's gaze, her voice cold and sharp. "You don't get to do this." Jake took another step forward, eyes pleading. "No," Emma snapped. "You don't get to show up out of nowhere and say things like that. You don't get to claim them." Matteo's fists clenched at his sides. His face was unreadable, but his eyes burned with a mix of shock and something dangerously close to betrayal. "You lied to me," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Emma's stomach dropped. Jake's face twisted in regret. "Matteo, Emma stepped between them, her entire body acting as a shield. "You will not do this here," she hissed. "Stay away from us." Jake looked as if he wanted to argue, but Emma didn't wait to hear it. She turned and walked away, her grip firm on her children, her pulse pounding so hard it drowned out everything else. She didn't stop. Not when Sophie asked questions, not when Matteo refused to speak, not even when her own hands started to tremble. Jake Carter had walked out of their lives once. She wouldn't let him walk back in. Emma paced back and forth in her small living room, her mind spinning. The encounter at the park had left her shaken, her emotions raw. She had spent years preparing for the possibility of Jake returning, yet nothing could have braced her for the reality of seeing him again, of hearing his voice, of watching Matteo's world crack open with just a few words. Matteo sat on the couch, his arms crossed, jaw clenched. He hadn't spoken a word since they got home. Sophie, sensing the tension, clung to her stuffed rabbit, her wide eyes darting between them. Emma exhaled slowly, steadying herself before kneeling in front of her son. "Matteo," she said gently, "I know you have questions." His gaze was sharp when it met hers. "You told me he was gone." His voice was low, controlled, but the betrayal underneath it was unmistakable. "You never said he could just show up one day." Emma swallowed against the lump in her throat. "Because I didn't think he would." Matteo's hands balled into fists. "You should have told me the truth." Emma closed her eyes for a brief second, guilt pressing down on her chest. "I did what I thought was best for you and Sophie. I didn't want you to grow up waiting for someone who might never come back." Matteo shot up from the couch. "Well, he did come back." His outburst startled Sophie, who flinched, pulling her rabbit tighter against her chest. Emma reached for Matteo, but he took a step back. "I need some air," he muttered before storming out the front door. Emma stared at the closed door, her hands trembling. This was exactly what she had feared. The moment Jake entered their lives again, everything she had built was at risk. Sophie's small voice broke through the silence. "Mommy, is that man really our daddy?" Emma's throat tightened. She forced a smile, running a hand gently over Sophie's hair. "Yes, sweetheart. He is." Sophie frowned. "Then why did he leave us?" The question cut like a blade. Emma wished she had a simple answer, one that would make sense to a child. But there was no easy way to explain abandonment. She pressed a kiss to Sophie's forehead. "I don't know, baby, but I promise you I will always be here." Sophie nodded, satisfied for now, but Emma knew this was only the beginning. Later that night, when the house was quiet and the weight of the day pressed heavily on her, Emma sat by the window, staring out into the dark street. Her phone vibrated on the table beside her. She didn't need to look to know who it was. "Jake, please, just talk to me." Emma's fingers hovered over the screen. For 5 years she had lived without him. She had raised 2 children, faced every challenge alone, and rebuilt herself from the wreckage he had left behind. And yet, for the first time in years, she hesitated. Emma sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The cafe in front of her was quiet, tucked away on a side street she used to know well. It had been her favorite place once, before everything fell apart. Through the large glass window she spotted him immediately. Jake sat at a table near the back, his posture tense, fingers tapping restlessly against the ceramic mug in front of him. He looked up just as she stepped out of the car, his expression unreadable. Emma inhaled sharply, then exhaled. She wasn't here for him. She was here for her children. Pushing the door open, she walked inside, her steps measured, controlled. Jake stood as she approached, but she didn't offer him a greeting. Instead, she pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "Thank you for coming," Jake finally said, his voice softer than she expected. Emma folded her arms across her chest. "Say what you need to say." Jake studied her, as if searching for the right words. "I know I don't deserve a chance to explain, but I need you to hear me out." Emma arched a brow. 5 years, Jake. 5 years without a single word. Do you have any idea what that did to us? His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. "I do, and I hate myself for it." She let out a cold laugh. "That doesn't change anything." Jake exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "Emma, when I left, I thought I was protecting you. I thought if I stayed, I'd be putting you and the kids in danger." Emma's expression faltered just slightly. "Danger?" Jake hesitated before continuing. "I made mistakes. Serious ones. I got involved with people I shouldn't have. I owed them more than I could pay, and when I realized how deep I was in, I knew I had to leave." His jaw tightened. "If I stayed, they would have come for me. And if they couldn't get to me, they would have come for you." Emma's breath hitched. She had spent years believing he had left because he didn't care, because she and the kids weren't enough. Now, he was telling her a different story, a story that, for the first time, made her question everything. "Why now?" she whispered. Jake leaned forward, his eyes pleading. "Because it's over. I fixed what I needed to fix. I spent 5 years trying to put my life back together so I could come back to you." Emma clenched her fists. "You don't get to come back after 5 years and expect things to be the same. Matteo and Sophie don't even know you." Jake's face twisted in pain. "I know, and I hate that. But I want to fix it." Emma shook her head. "You don't get to want things, Jake. Not anymore." He reached across the table, but she pulled back before he could touch her. "Emma," his voice cracked, "I don't want to fight with you. I just want to know them." Her heart clenched. Matteo and Sophie deserved the truth, but they also deserved stability, safety. She stared at him for a long time, searching for any sign that he was lying, that he was still the man who had walked away all those years ago. Finally, she spoke. "I don't trust you," she admitted. "But they're not just my kids. So I'll give you one chance." Jake's eyes widened slightly, as if he hadn't expected her to say yes. "One," she repeated, her voice firm. "And if you break their hearts, Jake, I swear to God, you'll never see them again." Jake nodded, his jaw tight. "I won't let them down again, I swear." Emma wanted to believe him, but trust was not something easily rebuilt. Matteo sat on his bed, his back pressed against the wall, knees drawn up to his chest. His mind replayed the words over and over. I'm your father. He had imagined this moment 100 different ways. Maybe his dad was a soldier who had been away on a mission. Maybe he had been lost somewhere, trying to find his way back. But in all those scenarios, there had always been a reason. A good reason. This wasn't that. His father had been alive, had chosen to leave, and now he was back. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Emma stepped inside, her face careful, measured. She had been walking on eggshells around him since they left the park. "Can we talk?" she asked. Matteo didn't respond right away. He wanted to be angry, wanted to yell, but mostly he just felt hollow. Emma sat on the edge of the bed. "I know you're upset." Matteo let out a bitter laugh. "Upset? Yeah, you could say that." Emma's hands wrung together in her lap. "I never wanted to lie to you." "Then why did you?" His voice cracked slightly, and he hated himself for it. Emma inhaled deeply. "Because I thought I was protecting you." Matteo finally looked at her. "From what? From him?" She hesitated. "From the pain of waiting for someone who might never come back." He swallowed the lump in his throat. "But he did." Emma's shoulders stiffened. "Yes, he did." Matteo wasn't sure how to process that. He had spent his whole life without a father. Now he had one, but it felt too late. "Do you want to see him?" Emma's voice was quiet. Matteo's stomach twisted. He didn't know what he wanted. But the more he thought about it, the angrier he became. "Does it even matter what I want?" he snapped. "He's just going to do whatever he wants anyway. That's what he's always done, right?" Emma flinched, but she didn't argue. After a long silence, Matteo shook his head. "I don't trust him." Emma nodded slowly. "I don't either." That surprised him. "Then why are you letting him back in?" Her eyes softened. "Because you and Sophie deserve the chance to decide for yourselves." Matteo looked away, his mind still a tangled mess of emotions. Emma reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind his ear, like she used to when he was little. "You don't have to forgive him, Matteo. You don't even have to talk to him if you don't want to, but I need you to know that you get to make that choice." Matteo stared at the wall. "And what if I never want to see him?" Emma hesitated. "Then I'll respect that." He wanted to believe her. But trust wasn't something easily rebuilt. Jake sat in his car outside the courthouse, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. This wasn't how he wanted things to go. He had hoped, prayed, that Emma would give him a chance to prove himself without forcing his hand. But after days of silence, after Matteo's anger and Emma's walls, he realized he had no other option. He wasn't going to disappear again. With a deep breath, he stepped out of the car, adjusting the cuffs of his suit jacket as he made his way up the courthouse steps. Every step felt heavier than the last. Inside, Emma was already waiting, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She looked exhausted, like the weight of the world was pressing down on her. The moment she saw him, her jaw tightened. "So this is what it comes to?" Jake exhaled. "I didn't want it to be this way." Emma let out a hollow laugh. "And yet here we are." A court officer led them into a small, sterile conference room. Their lawyers exchanged greetings, but Emma and Jake remained silent, locked in an unspoken battle of wills. The mediator, a woman in her 50s with a kind but firm demeanor, adjusted her glasses and looked between them. "Mr. Carter, Miss Thompson, we're here to discuss parental visitation rights regarding Matteo and Sophie Carter." Emma flinched slightly at the use of Jake's last name. Jake noticed but said nothing. The mediator continued. "Mr. Carter has expressed a desire to be involved in the children's lives. Ms. Thompson, you have contested this due to his prolonged absence." Emma's voice was sharp. "Because he left." Jake met her gaze. "Because I thought I was protecting you." Emma scoffed, shaking her head. "That excuse might have worked when we were younger, but not now." The mediator raised a hand, signaling for calm. "Mr. Carter, what are you seeking?" Jake straightened. "I want a relationship with my kids. I want the chance to prove I can be a father to them." Emma clenched her jaw. "And what happens when you get bored of playing dad, Jake? When work gets too busy? When life gets too complicated?" His stomach twisted. "That's not going to happen." Emma let out a slow breath, pressing her fingers to her temples. "You don't understand. They're not toys." You don't just get to pick them up and put them down when it's convenient for you. Jake's voice was quiet but firm. I know that, and I know I can't erase the past, but I can be here now. The mediator watched them carefully. Ms. Thompson, are you open to any form of visitation? Emma's shoulders sagged slightly, and for the first time since the meeting started, doubt flickered in her eyes. Jake leaned forward, his voice softer now. I just want a chance, Emma. She inhaled sharply, looking away. Supervised visits, she finally said. 1 hour once a week, that's all I can give you. Relief flooded Jake's chest, even as Emma refused to meet his gaze. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Jake sat on the edge of the park bench, hands clasped together, eyes fixed on the playground ahead. His heart pounded harder than it had in any boardroom, harder than it had in any deal he had ever closed. Today was the first time he would see Matteo and Sophie under the court's visitation agreement. 1 hour, supervised. A fragile, tentative step towards something he wasn't sure he even deserved. Emma arrived first, walking with steady determination, but her shoulders were stiff, her jaw set. Matteo trailed behind her, hands stuffed into his hoodie pockets, face unreadable. Sophie skipped slightly, less aware of the weight pressing down on the moment. Jake stood as they approached, forcing himself to stay still to wait. Emma stopped a few feet away. You have 1 hour, she reminded him, voice clipped. Jake nodded. Understood. Sophie tilted her head. Are we supposed to talk now? A small chuckle escaped Jake before he could stop it. Only if you want to. She studied him, then climbed onto the swing. Push me. Emma tensed slightly, but said nothing, as Sophie looked up at Jake expectantly. Jake hesitated only a moment before stepping behind her. He gave the swing a gentle push, watching as Sophie laughed softly, kicking her feet out. The sound was foreign to him, beautiful, but unfamiliar. Matteo, standing a few feet away, watched everything in silence. His arms remained crossed, his expression carefully guarded. Jake met his gaze. Matteo! The boy cut him off. I don't know you. Jake swallowed. I know, and that's my fault. Matteo's eyes darkened. Yeah, it is. Jake exhaled, nodding. You have every right to be angry, Matteo scoffed. I'm not angry, I just don't care. Sophie twisted slightly on the swing. That's not true, she said simply. Matteo shot her a glare, but Sophie only shrugged. Jake crouched down slightly, keeping his voice even. I don't expect you to trust me, Matteo. I don't expect you to like me. But I want to know you. Both of you. Matteo's gaze flickered, something unreadable crossing his face. But before he could respond, Sophie hopped off the swing and grabbed Jake's wrist, tugging him toward the slide. Come on, she said. You have to push me down too. Jake let out a breath, allowing himself a small smile. All right. As he helped her climb, he risked a glance at Matteo. The boy hadn't moved, hadn't softened, but he was still standing there, and for now, that was enough. Emma sat in her car outside the school, gripping the steering wheel as she watched Matteo through the windshield. He stood near the entrance, his backpack slung over one shoulder, eyes scanning the street. He wasn't looking for her, he was looking for him. Jake had been showing up for his visits, every week, without fail, and Sophie, open, forgiving, hopeful Sophie, was warming up to him. She talked about him now, little things he said, how he pushed her on the swings just the right way. Emma saw the way her daughter's face lit up when she mentioned him, and it terrified her. But Matteo was different. He was cautious, reserved, still angry, though he wouldn't admit it out loud. And yet here he was, standing at the curb, waiting for someone who might not come. Emma took a slow breath, then opened the door and stepped out. Hey, she called gently. Matteo turned, his expression unreadable. Hey, she nodded toward the street. Do you need a ride? He hesitated. I was going to walk. Emma studied him. Or were you waiting? Matteo's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. Emma sighed, glancing down the street. No sign of Jake. She hated that she felt relieved. Matteo shifted his weight. He's late. Emma folded her arms. That happens sometimes, Matteo scoffed. Yeah, I know. A beat of silence passed between them, then in the distance the low rumble of an engine. A sleek black car turned the corner, moving quickly. Jake. Emma felt Matteo tense beside her. She watched as the boy clenched his fists, watched as the walls he had spent weeks building threatened to crumble. Jake pulled up to the curb, rolling down the window. "Matteo!" But Matteo was already turning away. "Forget it," he muttered, walking toward Emma's car instead. Jake climbed out quickly. "Matteo, wait." Matteo spun around, his face twisted in frustration. "You said you'd be here on time." Jake ran a hand through his hair. "I know. I got caught up at work, but I came as fast as I—" "Work," Matteo repeated, his voice dripping with disappointment. "Of course." Jake took a step closer. "Please, let me explain." Matteo shook his head. "I don't care. It's not like I was waiting for you or anything." Emma's heart clenched. She could hear the hurt buried beneath the anger, could see the way Matteo's shoulders had tensed, bracing for impact. Jake swallowed hard. "I messed up, but I'll do better. I will." Matteo stared at him for a long moment. Then finally he let out a breath and turned toward Emma. "Can we just go home?" Emma hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, let's go." As Matteo climbed into the passenger seat, Jake took a step back, watching them. His face was tight, his hands curled into fists at his sides. Emma met his gaze for only a second before getting into the car and pulling away. In the rearview mirror, she saw Jake still standing there, unmoving, and for the first time he looked truly afraid. Jake sat in his office staring blankly at the documents spread across his desk. The numbers, the contracts, the signatures. None of it mattered. Not when his son had walked away from him today with disappointment in his eyes. He had told himself he wouldn't fail them again. But one mistake, one late arrival, had been enough to reopen every wound Matteo carried. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. His assistant poked her head in. "Mr. Carter, your next meeting, cancel it." She blinked. "Sir? Cancel everything for the rest of the day." His voice was tight, controlled. "Reschedule if necessary." The assistant hesitated but nodded. "Of course." As soon as she left, Jake grabbed his phone. His fingers hovered over Emma's number. He had tried texting Matteo, no response. He couldn't let this sit. He pressed call. It rang twice before Emma answered. "What do you want, Jake?" Her voice was guarded. Jake exhaled. "I need to see him." "Not happening." Jake ran a hand over his face. "Emma, please, I messed up. I know that. But I need to fix it. He's not ready to talk to you." Jake clenched his jaw. "Then let me talk to you. Tell me what to do." Emma was silent for a moment. Then her voice softened just slightly. "Jake, this isn't a business deal. You don't get to negotiate your way back into his life." Jake closed his eyes. "I just want him to know I'm not giving up." A sigh on the other end. "Then prove it with actions, not words." The line went dead. Jake set the phone down, her words echoing in his mind. Actions, not words. He had spent years building an empire, making calculated decisions, fixing every mistake that threatened his success. But this wasn't about business, this was about being a father. And for the first time in his life, he didn't have a strategy. He just had to show up. Matteo sat on the back steps of the house, staring at the sky as the last traces of daylight faded. The quiet hum of the neighborhood filled the air, distant cars, the laughter of kids playing down the street, the faint sound of Sophie watching cartoons inside. Emma stepped outside, a warm mug in her hands. She didn't sit beside him right away. She just stood there, watching him the way she always did when she wasn't sure how to help. After a moment, she lowered herself onto the step. "Long day?" Matteo shrugged. "I guess." Emma handed him the mug. "Hot chocolate." He took it without a word, letting the warmth seep into his fingers. They sat in silence for a while. Then quietly, Emma spoke. "Jake called." Matteo tensed, but didn't look at her. "Figures. He wants to fix things," she continued. "He knows he messed up." Matteo scoffed. "Yeah? And that's supposed to make everything okay?" "No," Emma admitted, "but it means he's trying." Matteo took a slow sip of the hot chocolate, letting the sweetness settle on his tongue. He wanted to say he didn't care, that it didn't matter, but the truth sat heavy in his chest. He had waited for his father before, and he had been let down. Emma's voice was softer now. I'm not telling you to forgive him, Matteo, but I am telling you that you get to decide what happens next. Matteo stared into the mug, watching the steam curl into the air. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't sure what he wanted, and that scared him more than anything. Jake stood outside the school, leaning against his car, hands shoved into his coat pockets. The crisp morning air bit at his skin, but he barely noticed. His eyes were locked on the entrance, waiting. He had arrived early this time, very early. No meetings, no distractions, no excuses. Just him, showing up. The doors swung open, and a flood of students spilled onto the sidewalk. Sophie was the first to spot him. Her eyes lit up, and for a second Jake thought she might run to him, but she hesitated, glancing at Matteo first. Matteo had seen him too. Their eyes met across the distance. Jake's heart pounded. He expected Matteo to turn away, to ignore him completely, but instead the boy stopped walking. He didn't move closer, but he didn't leave either. Jake took a breath. A chance. He raised a hand in a small wave. Nothing big, nothing overwhelming. Just a silent acknowledgement. Matteo didn't wave back, but he didn't walk away. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Jake gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white as he pulled into the hospital parking lot. His mind raced, heart pounding in his chest. Emma's voice over the phone still echoed in his head. It's Matteo. He got hurt. He barely remembered the drive, barely registered the world around him as he pushed through the hospital doors. The fluorescent lights, the sterile smell, the quiet murmur of voices. None of it mattered. He spotted Emma immediately. She stood near the nurse's station, arms wrapped tightly around herself, exhaustion and worry etched into her face. "Emma," he said, breathless. "Where is he?" She turned, startled. For a moment her guard was down, and he saw it. The fear, the helplessness. Then, just as quickly, she straightened. "He's okay," she said, voice tight. "They're running tests, but he's awake." Relief crashed over him, so strong his legs almost gave out. "What happened?" Emma exhaled. "Soccer game. Another kid went in too hard. He fell wrong, hit his head." Jake dragged a hand down his face. "Jesus." Emma hesitated, then motioned toward the hallway. "You can see him." Jake didn't wait for permission twice. He moved quickly, stepping into the hospital room. Matteo sat on the bed, a small bandage on his forehead, his arms crossed as he stared at the muted television screen. Sophie sat beside him, her tiny legs swinging off the chair, her hands gripping a stuffed animal. Jake's breath hitched. "Matteo." The boy looked at him then, his expression unreadable. "You came." Jake swallowed hard. "Of course I did." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Matteo looked away, his voice quieter. "Mom said you used to play soccer." Jake's chest tightened. "I did." Matteo traced a finger over the hospital blanket. "Were you good?" Jake chuckled softly. "I had my moments." Silence stretched between them again, but this time it wasn't as heavy. Then, quietly, Matteo spoke. "I don't know if I can trust you." Jake's throat tightened. He nodded, forcing himself to meet his son's eyes. "I know, but I'm not going anywhere." Matteo studied him for a long time. Then, slowly, he nodded. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Jake stood at the park, hands in his pockets, watching as Matteo and Sophie ran ahead. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over everything, the warmth of the day lingering in the air. Sophie laughed as she raced toward the swings, and for the first time Matteo didn't keep his distance. He wasn't completely open yet, but he was here. Emma sat on a nearby bench, arms crossed, watching everything unfold. She had been hesitant about today, about letting Jake have this moment with them outside of court-ordered visits. But she had agreed. Jake walked over and sat beside her. "Thank you for this," he said quietly. Emma exhaled. "Don't make me regret it." He smiled faintly. "I won't." They sat in silence, watching the kids. Sophie climbed onto the swing and waved at Jake. "Push me." Jake glanced at Emma for approval. She hesitated, then nodded. He stood, making his way over. As he gently pushed Sophie higher, he felt Matteo's gaze on him. Jake turned slightly. "Want to turn?" Matteo hesitated. Then, to Jake's surprise, he stepped forward. He didn't say anything, didn't smile, but he chose to stand beside him. Jake felt his chest tighten. It wasn't everything, but it was more than he ever thought he'd get. Sophie ran ahead toward the front door, her little hands gripping the straps of her backpack as she turned back to look at Jake. "Are you coming inside?" Jake hesitated, glancing at Emma. She stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching him carefully. It had been months since the first time he saw them in the park. Months of slow, careful steps, of building something from nothing. He still wasn't sure where he stood with Emma, but with Sophie the walls had come down, and with Matteo, well, they were getting there. "Just for a minute," Emma finally said. Sophie grinned, pushing the door open and disappearing inside. Jake followed, stepping into the house that had never been his, but somehow felt like the only place he wanted to be. He took in the familiar scent of home-cooked meals, the faint sound of a TV playing in the background. Matteo sat on the couch, his feet tucked under him as he scrolled through his phone. He didn't look up, but he didn't leave either. That was progress. Jake cleared his throat. "Hey, kid." Matteo glanced at him, then back at his phone. "Hey." Jake looked at Emma, uncertain. She sighed, tilting her head toward the kitchen. "Coffee?" He nodded. "Yeah, that'd be nice." As he followed her, he caught sight of a framed picture on the wall. A photo of Sophie and Matteo laughing, arms wrapped around each other. His chest tightened. This was the life he had missed, the moments he had given up. But he was here now. Emma handed him a mug, leaning against the counter. "They're getting used to you." Jake met her gaze. "Are you?" She let out a soft breath, looking down at her own coffee. "I don't know." Silence stretched between them. Then from the living room, Sophie's voice rang out. "Dad, can you help me with my backpack?" Jake's breath caught. Emma stilled. He swallowed hard, setting the mug down before turning toward the sound of her voice. It wasn't much, but it was everything. If this story moved you, if you felt the weight of every choice, every hesitation, every step toward healing, share your thoughts in the comments and tell us, can trust truly be rebuilt? Can love find its way back after years of absence? If you believe in second chances, in the power of family and in the strength it takes to forgive, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more heart-touching stories, and share it with someone who needs to hear this today. Because sometimes, the hardest journeys lead to the most unforgettable endings.